Hi, this is Christoph von Tomme from Pronavix, and I'd like to bring to you 7 models to reinvent your organization. It's a presentation that I was supposed to do at the Innersourcing Summit in Galway, but I lost my voice and I couldn't give it a presentation. But because I'm really excited about this topic, I didn't want to withhold it and keep it for another summit, but instead to make a recording that I can share online, so that I can start getting feedback on some of these topics, because I think they're super relevant to what we're doing in the inner sourcing community and the wider community, open source and several other areas. Now, my throat is still not 100%. I hope it won't bother you too much, but yeah, well. So 7 models, or is it 7 principles? I'm still a little bit on the fence. It might be. It's basically the idea behind this talk is I've been I read a lot of books, and I've been looking at a lot of the literature that's been published lately, or in the last 10-20 years, trying to better understand what's going on in the open source world, because we're an open source company, a company Pronavix. We started as a Drupal agency, and for 13 years we've been growing with and in the Drupal community. And 3 years ago, we made a pivot and we started fully dedicating ourselves to developer portals. But still, a lot of these ideas are still relevant to what we're doing, also in the developer portal space. I always put this slide. We call ourselves probably the only consultancy fully dedicated to the developer portal development. I put that as a question mark, because if you know about anybody who's also fully dedicated, so I'm not talking about agencies that also do developer portals, but if you know other agencies that are fully dedicated to developer portals, then I'd love to hear about that. Yeah. So why this talk? Where did the idea come from? If you look at the definition of inner source, then there's 2 components to it. There's one which is the adoption of open source software development best practices, and then the tools, and the establishment of an open source like culture within an organization. So and I think the best practices and the tools, that's the easy bit. And it's the culture that is just really hard. It's very hard. Engineering culture is nearly impossible. So I was thinking about that. How do you do that? And what are some of the ideas that I've learned from the Drupal world and from all the reading that I've done from this perspective of a Drupal community member, an open source community member, and that I can share with this community, and that can highlight some of the ideas that I've been thinking about. But before I get into all of that, I want to do a really short thank you ritual that I would do on every presentation. First of all, I'd like to thank the inner sourcing community. I've been delighted with the willingness to share, and just the sheer excitement for sharing and open source, and for making things better together, that I've found in the inner source world. So thank you for that. I'd like to thank my colleagues who make it possible for me to travel to Galway and then come back home and do this presentation, and my family. But why do I think, or what's my take on why the world needs inner source? I found this article fairly recently that was published in Forbes, which is about what they called the Copernican revolution in management. So the idea was that there's a shift happening today in the world where we're going from a focus on businesses and their processes towards a focus on people, be those customers or employees, or more in general, stakeholders, and their needs, rather than the processes of the organization. So now there's this shift happening towards a more human-friendly way of doing organizations. But I believe that all of this is part of a much larger switch that is going on. That is actually the result of our information technology. I believe that what's going on is a switch from complicated systems to complex systems. Now, I got this insight when I was reading Brave New Work, really interesting book that I highly recommend, in which the author explains what he understands to be the difference between complicated and complex systems. Because he's talking about complex conscious organizations. Basically, the way I think to explain it, a complicated system is a system that works like a machine that has like lots of moving parts. That has it's hard to fully understand right away, but it is still deterministic. Like if you give it the same input, you're going to get the same output. And a complex system is a system in which multiple agents are interacting with each other that is non-deterministic. If you give it the same input, you might get a whole different output. And what we've been doing for the last 100 years is we've been building organizations that work like machines, where if you give it the same input, you're going to get the same output. You create strict processes in which people are implementing and executing specific processes that are very effective, that are very efficient. They're very good at maximizing production, but they're not very adaptive. So what I think is going on is that with the introduction of information technology, we've massively, exponentially increased the number of interactions that people can have with each other and organizations can have with each other, where you used to interact with just the people around you, people in your company, people in your neighborhoods. Suddenly you're able to interact with everybody on the whole planet. And so the complexity of human civilization has massively increased. And this increasing complexity has made it so that where it used to be possible to make an approximation of a process, like a complicated system that was an approximation of what was going on in reality, that is no longer able to cope with the changes that are happening, because this massive rise in complexity is calling for complex systems to address these complex environments. So, and because our machines, our organizations that were built like machines, they're not able to cope anymore. And what I think is going on is that we have to adapt all of our culture in organizations, in our local communities, in our personal lives, in our governments, all have to be adapted to this shift towards a more complex environment. And all of our organizations will have to become complex to be able to deal with this rapidly changing environment. Because just like in mathematics, you can approximate a nonlinear function with a linear function. So you can take something that's like you can create like an asymptote, no matter how many dimensions or with how many variables. That is possible, but it doesn't really tell the whole story. So I think what's going on is this, is where we used to be able to just have an asymptote. We could create a complicated system that approximated the complexity, or that approximated the behavior of the complex system or the complex environment in which it operated. But now these complex systems are completely going crazy, and we no longer it's no longer sufficient. So I think that in a world of complex interactions, complicated systems fail. And what I want to talk about in this presentation is about the fault lines that you can see in the traditional systems, like where unexpected things are happening, and like most of them will come from the open source world or be related to the open source world. Like looking at where are the fault lines, where do we see unexpected behavior, and what does that teach us about the principles of complex systems. So on that note, like I'll make a whole lot of references to a whole lot of different books also in this talk. By no means do I wish to pretend that if you just watch this presentation, you'll know everything that's in each of these individual books. I recommend you to go and check out like the ones that you're interested in, and do further reading. So first I want to talk about complexity. So there's this thing which is kind of interesting, that small teams innovate faster. Now, I've been reading this in a lot of books. I've been seeing it around me, that if you have a small organization with a small team, they might be able to run circles around larger companies. So now, why is that? And I think the answer to that probably, it's a continuation of this initial thought around complexity versus complicated systems. But I think these three books are a very good primer to start thinking about it. Reinventing Organizations talks about building living organizations that are more adaptive. I think that the middle one, Organized for Complexity, is probably it explains why, and then Brave New Work explains how you can actually implement a living organization. So like the first one is kind of sketching the problem. The second one gives a deeper why of why small organizations are more rapidly adaptive. And then Brave New Work gives an idea about how you go around and implement organizations like that. But in a very, very short nutshell, I think that this comes from the middle book, Organized for Complexity. Hierarchical organizations have less contact surface with customers. And because of that, they have less surface to interact and to learn. It's better to have organizations that maximize contact surface with customers, and that are have as small as possible internal surface, so that you can do the most learning from the organization. Hierarchical organizations are kind of like container ships. They're very, very powerful. They can they have a giant momentum. Once they're going, they just keep going. But they're not really agile to steer, versus swarms of bees, where individual bees like fly around and find information, bring it back to the hive, teach the others, and then collectively they create this adaptive behavior. So I think that to thrive, kind of like the core lesson from all of this is that to thrive in a fast-changing environment, you need a complex adaptive system. Okay, that was a warm-up. Second, I want to talk about motivation. Because there's this weird thing in open source. Is like, why do people, like millions of people, voluntarily contribute to open source? And like, if you look at that from a pure economical model, in the traditional sense, it doesn't really make much sense. And I think the key to that is that we've had this misunderstanding where there's this misunderstanding where people believe that people can only be motivated by rewards. Like people only do things if they're going to get something from it. For this topic, I'd like to recommend two books. One is Drive, that explains this model of like what makes intrinsic versus extrinsic rewards, and Punished by Rewards, that talks about why even rewards can be very similar to punishments. And the model that to draw it into kind of something like a model. The key lesson from all of this is that extrinsic motivators kill intrinsic motivation. So if you give people extrinsic motivations, be that rewards or punishments, it will it will reduce their intrinsic motivation, their pleasure of doing something just for the sake of it. And intrinsic motivation almost always beats extrinsic motivation. If you can make people do something because they feel autonomy, they feel they can get mastery or find purpose in it, they're going to do it better and they're going to learn faster, and they're just generally going to be happier and healthier and perform better. With intrinsic rewards, the key thing there is that rewards and praise are also extrinsic rewards, just like punishments and scolding. So if you're even if you're using carrots rather than sticks, and yes, carrots are better than sticks, but even carrots are bad because they take away the internal motivation, the intrinsic motivation. Now I had to talk about this with Kat from Red Hat, and she remarked something interesting that I didn't find in any of these models, and this was like the need for recognition and for community. And so I don't think that these models are complete. And I think there's an aspect, at least an aspect of belonging that's maybe somewhere in between the two, because it's both. You could see it as an extrinsic reward because it creates like safety, but you could also see it as an intrinsic reward because it's not, you don't immediately get something out of it. It's more like a sink of goodwill, or maybe, very maybe, that you could see belonging as, and that also plays that plays a lot in open source communities. The key lesson from all of this is that motivation is not about sticks, but it's also not about carrots. For me, this was a shocker that rewards are also kind of bad. Like you should try to make sure people have enough, and then kind of forget about all of that, and then move on to another plane where you're doing the important work, where you work with intrinsic rewards. Next, I want to talk about cooperation. Like for people that are interested in all the ant pictures, this is a species that's living together with a special type of acacia, like acacia. I don't know what it is in English. Probably acacia tree, where the plant creates living space for the ants, and the ants protect the plant. It's beautiful. Now, cooperation. How do open source communities cooperate without budgets or bosses? Because this is kind of, if you would have gone back in time, and you would have said, like 30 years ago, we're going to have communities of millions of people that are going to be very innovative and do all kinds of interesting stuff, and they're not going to have any budgets or bosses. I would have been very, I don't know if people would have believed you, but that's what open source did. And I think that actually it exposes a fault line that I learned a lot more about when I read this book. It's the first 5,000 Years of Debt by David Graeber. He's an anthropologist, and he talks about like the history of money and economics, and well, not necessarily history, but he goes out and shows by counterexamples that people do not always have transactional relationships. That this concept of, hey, imagine a world without money. I've got chickens, you have a cow. How do we exchange them? It's hard, right? Like, do I give you like a piece of my cow for one chicken, or how do we do this? That doesn't really work. What he demonstrates in his research, or in the review of anthropological research, is that this does not hold, that in small communities people just give to each other, and that actually these transactional relationships, that equivalent exchange where I give you something if you give me something, that this is a behavioral pattern or cultural pattern that only really emerges or really becomes dominant once a community adapts money. and that before money, transactional relationships are nowhere near as important as once money really starts to be used. So I have this theory where that money is a technology, and the transactional relationships are a complementary culture that fits with this technology, or maybe also technology, that allowed us to scale our communities beyond smaller, like villages, and that in fact, as humans, we lived for hundreds of, well, let's say hundreds of thousands of years. Um, we had communities that did not work with equivalent exchange. So this is very, very recent innovation that we've developed. So, but that also means that maybe it is possible to have collaboration at scale that is not transactional. Maybe it is possible to create a society in which we're creating the greatest value for all the participants involved without having to rely on tit for tat. Like, if you do this for me, I'm going to give you money. And I think we are already doing this in open source world. And I think I think there's a lot of places where transactional relationships, like right now, what's going on throughout the world is you see transactional relationships seeping into pretty much everything. Like, some people even do transactional relationships with their kids, where mow the lawn, else you don't get money. And what we're doing is we're shifting our relatedness, our connections, our personal relationships. We're making them all transactional, which gives us more freedom. So money is great because it gives us freedom, but it also turns us into islands, and it makes us more solitary. And I think this transactionalization of society is one of the core reasons why we're seeing so much depression and misery. So I think, I'm not saying that we should get rid of money, but I think that maybe there's another way of doing collaboration at scale. Next one is communication, and I had communication here, but could just as well have been conflict, because one of the things I've been thinking a lot about is, why do we have all this polarization in our communities, and how does it come that this is really destroying our communities? And one of these two books were breakthrough books for me, because it helped me a lot in my personal relationships. The Anatomy of Peace talks about how we co-create the conflicts in our lives. That we are, when we have a conflict with someone, we are always a participant in it, and then we're also doing something wrong. And that if we can recognize what we're doing, we can stop escalating the conflicts that we're having. And nonviolent communication shows how to actually do that. It's a really beautiful, very interesting book that explains like a model for communicating better around conflict. In a very small, well, in a nutshell, it comes down to this: is that most people are used to talking in personification and in strategies. So, like, for example, they'll say, "Oh, you're always lazy," or "You're always doing this," or you are something, like you are this kind of person. Or they'll, when they're having conflict, they'll say like, "Let's do this," or "I think we should do this." And instead of clearly articulating their feelings and their needs, they immediately jump to a strategy to solve those feelings and needs. And most people, me myself included, we just jump over that step where we actually realize what our needs are. We just, like, I have this with my son. He'll say like, "Oh, Dad, let's play a game. Let's play this game." And I was like, "Well, I don't really have time for it right now. But what is it actually that you need? Would you like to be together?" "Well, yeah, actually, I would like to be together." "Okay, let's find a way that we can be together without doing it in a strategy that you've proposed that I currently don't have time for. So, and I'm still absorbing this framework and this knowledge, but I think it's incredibly powerful, because the moment you understand that conflicts are not conflicts, are not this bad thing, that conflicts are not a thing that is going to tear you apart, when you can start trusting conflicts and see them as a tension field that shows you where you need to change, or where something has to happen to become a better community, they become a source of infinite learning. It's like in Stoicism, they call it the obstacle is the road. I think that conflicts show us the road. They show us where it is that we can become better. And if you can absorb this in your culture, then you can then conflicts can become something really valuable that you celebrate rather than shy away from, and have to do it like in a hush-hush way. So I think that if we can focus around needs and feelings instead of around identity and strategy, conflicts can become growth engines instead of a bad thing. Next is language. And language is another of those things where we're not really conscious about it. It's just like money. It's something that's there. It's between us, and we use it all the time without fully realizing what we're using and what we're doing. And the question that I want to ask you is like, how can you recognize great communities? And there was this really interesting book, Tribal Leadership, that talked about 5 language patterns and the cultures that go with them, that explain, for me, that were a very interesting lens to look through, for recognizing like what was going on in our organization. The 5 lenses are the following: the world sucks, my life sucks, I'm great, we are great, and the world is great. So like people that are in the world sucks, they're in a really, really bad spot. This is like where people have depressions and don't really know what to do next. And like what they describe in the book is that if you have someone in that stage, you can only take them like one stage at a time upwards normally. Like, bring them, help them to evolve. You can put them into an organization that is in a different stage and that can help them to accelerate. But growing through these stages, especially someone who's lived their whole life in one of the lower stages, and nobody's always is ever stuck in one stage only. Like people are adaptive, and in one community they might behave in one way, in our community they might behave another way. But the interesting things that I want to highlight out of this diagram is this thing: I'm great, but you're not. And a lot of communities that I've seen people do become rock stars, where by standing above others, they're also pushing down the others, and by saying I'm great, it also means that somebody else will not be great. So and the reason why I had this picture here, go back a little bit, is that often in hospitals this is the case, and like this is today I think a lot of you are cringing when you see this picture, but it's this idea where one person can be like, I'm great, but all of you are just not that smart. And so that's like one lesson. The other lesson from this is that at the top, the world is great. He describes it in the book how they thought that we are great. It was going to be the biggest, like the highest level. But then they found these other organizations that were performing way, way better than we are great organizations. And they didn't really understand it. And then they realized that basically these organizations had completely forgotten about competition. They didn't forget about it, but their they were acting as if there was no competition, and they were just having an awesome time being alive and doing interesting things. And yeah, so I think the key lesson from this model was that language is an indicator of cultural maturity, and then also that the most performant cultures, in the most performant cultures, competition and scarcity disappears. So I've been chasing this, like how can I remove scarcity? How can I create a space for my team where they don't need to worry about competition, because it's going so well that we're just living in a great world, and we can just innovate and be productive together and contribute to the world. And I think those are like I think it's fascinating how these are the most productive cultures also, like where people can really feel very, very good. Next, and there's two more. Next is value. And this comes from another book, from Project to Product, from Mick Kirsten. And one thing that jumped out from this book to me was this concept that, like, why is it so hard to find bottlenecks in software projects? Because normally in a production facility, you can fairly easily figure out like where the bottleneck is. But in software projects, you can't really. So the idea here was that software projects and consultancies and software teams are operating like a network where you route around, just like in the internet, you route around congestion, and that's why you can't see where the bottleneck is, because you just route around the problems. And that was I think very, very interesting. So the digital businesses are value networks rather than value streams. Yeah, this also talks to the whole complexity consciousness. And the last one, this has been a very influential book for me, is about thinking around constraints. So I'm showing a cup. Have you ever, like, what is the most important thing of a cup? It's not the material, because you can make a cup from pretty much anything that's solid. A cup, the key thing, it's not the how you hold it. The key thing is the empty space that it creates. A cup is a constraint in which liquids in a gravitational field can be held in place. And this leads to, this idea of constraints leads to this question, like, how do you, in a self-organizing system, how do you protect yourself from failing? So like, if you're going towards a complex system that's self-organizing, how can you prevent it from failing? Because you've lost control. Self-organizing systems are out of control. And I'd like to talk about 3 books for that. First of all, I think I was heavily influenced by the ideas from Terence and Deacon's ideas. I read his book also, but it's very hard. I spent a whole summer on it, and I still didn't fully understand it. So instead, I would recommend you to read Neither Ghost Nor Machine from Jeremy Sherman, who's a friend of Terence Deacon, who explains it a lot easier. And he explains how you can go from basic thermodynamic systems using constraints to a living self-organizing system that's an infinite game that wants to keep itself alive. So he describes, and he then pulls that further towards explaining how information works, how living systems work, what the difference is between an energy dissipation system like a fire and a living system, and so on and so on. But the core idea is that you don't try to create a fully paved road. You don't create a complicated system that's deterministic. The living systems have constraints, both static and dynamic constraints. Static constraints that are constraints that can be called in when they're needed, like in genes. And dynamic constraints, the constraints that are happening inside of the system by the pieces that are already there, like in a living system. Like in a cell, you have the cell membrane, which is a constraint, but then there's also the proteins that are constraints for specific molecular reactions, where they provide just the right constraint for proteins to fold in a certain way so that a certain transition is going to be made easier. And so that's like one aspect. So like, the way you can do that in organizations is like for example, by working with checklists rather than we're working with fully written out procedures. I'm not saying that procedures are bad or that you shouldn't be doing procedures, but I like if you want to have an adaptive system, you need to create place for innovation to happen, and that only really happens if there's a flexibility in how that works. So that's one aspect. And the other aspect I got from Nassim Taleb's Anti-Fragile is this idea of how do you create a system that gains from disorder? He talks about the way Netflix with Chaos Monkey. I think pretty much everybody who's here or who's listened to this might have heard of Chaos Monkey. If you didn't, go check it out. It was very interesting. It's this idea that you create an operator in your system that will go and turn things off one by randomly, and then you have your system react to it to make sure that it stays up. And by reacting to it, you're learning and you're becoming more resilient. So in the Anti-Fragile, the idea is that if you have an organism like a human is built out of lots and lots of cells, and it's only because there's individual cells that are allowed to die, that are allowed to fail, that the whole organism is able to be so successful. Because if you get hurt, it's just a few cells that die, and it's not the whole organism that dies, because they're containerized and it's able to recover from that. So the core two principles for creating living systems, therefore, I think, or two core principles that I derive from all of this is that you working with constraints rather than suffocating bureaucracy and procedures is like one way, and then the other thing is that working with a multicellular organism where there's units that are allowed to fail, but where you can recover the resources from the failing units. And the resources I'm using, and normally I don't use that when I talk about people, but also you can recover the team members from failing subunits to do new things and to build new cells in the system. So basically, living systems are so adaptive and are so good at staying alive, because if you think about it, we have this unbroken chain of life from first life all the way to us, or first life in our forefathers, all the way to us, where there's an unbroken chain of living systems that kept alive, that kept living. And the way they've done that is by having only just enough constraints so that there's room for innovation and for growth. So rather than defining a perfect process, it just has a couple of nudges at the right moment. And by having fallible substructures to gain immortality, actually, if you think about it, for living systems. So, conclusion. I know that all of these are kind of like ideas that are a little bit haphazard, coming from different directions. But I think all of this is connected, and there's a new science of complex systems that is evolving, and I believe that all of humanity will have to adapt to it. That who doesn't adapt will be left behind, and just will be outcompeted. And that we're in this transition from complicated systems that are deterministic to complex systems that are evolutionary. And the best part of it is that at the same time we're creating places and organizations that are much more natural for people to live in, where it's a lot healthier to be human. Um, and yeah, I'll leave you with that. Thank you for watching all the way to the end. These are the Wikimedia pictures that I've used to create this presentation.